This chapter is about environmental costing. It's really about how management accountants can ensure that environmental costs are managed properly in a business. Now, in order to manage environmental costs, really what we've got to do is make sure that we can see them. And the important point here is in paragraph 1.2, that in the past, environmental costs were treated very much as production overheads. And because of that, they were kind of hidden from management scrutiny. Now, there's many reasons now why we can't do that anymore. We can't just allow them to get lost in production overheads. What we want to do is try and make sure that we have a much more transparent approach to environmental costs. So let's have a look at these benefits. The first benefit there is just purely an ethical issue. So it's the right thing to do for a business to be aware of how their production methods are going to affect the environment. So things like carbon emissions or pollution into rivers. So clearly, if it's a business that cares about ethical issues, then they should really want to minimise those. And they need to know what they are before they can even start to do that. The second is it might actually be quite good for the brand. So if we go about doing things from a green perspective, then that can be quite a good selling point. So even looking at it purely from a profits basis, it will increase our profits because hopefully people will want to buy from companies who care about the environment. It also means that when we're pricing our products, we can actually price products higher that have a detrimental effect on the environment. So that should mean that our prices are much more accurate, and hopefully that's going to also lead to improved profitability. Now, at the moment, there isn't very much need for reporting from a regulatory point of view on environmental costs, but a lot of businesses now are preempting the need to report on such things. Now, it's very likely that in the not too distant future, then there will be aspects of environmental costs that need to be reported externally, and therefore if we can get some of those systems in place, then that's only going to be a good thing. And of course, the last thing is that once we identify what the costs are going to be, then we can start to control and reduce them. If they're purely lost in production overheads, we've got no idea what the costs are. How on earth are we going to start trying to reduce them? So this is all very important issues to do with environmental costing, and management accountants can really help here by thinking about how we can actually take those environmental costs and make them so that we can see them much more clearly than we ever have done. Lecture example 1. So lecture example 1 is a little bit of practice at coming up with some environmental costs. Now, it uses a business which is in the agricultural industry to give you some ideas, and they use manufacturing chemicals. The industry here isn't that important, but just see if you can list some environmental costs that Raxo may need to consider. So pause the presentation, and when you're ready, press play. Okay, so they may need some emissions permits, so permission to make emissions into the atmosphere. They may have some waste disposal costs. That would be also an environmental cost. Training on environmental issues for their staff. Maybe some fines for any pollution incidents that happen. And any environmental taxes. So you may have come up with some other examples as well. In the exam, an angle of environmental costing is likely to be the classification into internalised and externalised environmental cost. So what do we mean by these terms? Internalised environmental cost means that costs are incurred by a company as part of its operations. Now, these costs are where the company pays their full cost and there's no cost being picked up by society itself. Now, they might relate to production of a finished good, and they might also relate to disposal of any waste materials. And they might have to do that to satisfy some sort of regulation. So we've got some examples of these listed. So things like emissions permits, environmental taxes, waste disposal, environmental training, and record keeping and recording. So the company pays all of that cost, and the public won't know anything about it. Now, in contrast to that, we've got externalized environmental costs. Now, an externalized environmental cost is a cost that is felt by society as a whole. So society pays at least an element of this, and probably the most well-known one of these would be something like global warming. Now, there's some particular areas that you should know a little bit about, and we'll go through these next. The first one is carbon emissions. Now, the United Nations has had several world summits to address the impact of carbon emissions and the fact that greenhouse gases is actually having a detrimental effect on the environment. What the EU have introduced is a system for trading emission consents. And that means that if organisations can operate below their limits, they can sell their spare capacity, their spare emissions capacity, to other companies. And therefore there's actually a financial incentive to minimise the carbon footprint of that company. One that you'll probably all be aware of is energy, because it's likely that wherever you work that you've had to be part of some of these energy saving schemes. It's a very, very large controllable cost that an organisation can actually reduce. So that's clearly going to save them money, and that's going to have a direct impact on their profit. And there's also incentives in place to encourage the use of sustainable energy sources. So practical things to reduce energy, things like efficient lighting, turning off IT equipment, and car sharing. And I'm sure you can think of lots more. And the third one there is water. Now, using water uses energy, and there's some production processes that use loads and loads of water. Sometimes when the water is disposed of, it's dirty and it goes into the environment, and if it's not treated properly, it can lead to a lot of long-term damage, not only to waterways, but also destruction of flora and fauna that actually survive in those waterways. Now, many of these costs are actually quite difficult to quantify, and it's not only financially that we perhaps need to quantify them. There might be some health impacts that we need to consider on present generations, but also on future generations as well. So we'll turn our attention to how we manage environmental costs. Now, in order to manage environmental costs, we do need to be able to see what they are. And once again, just to recap, the driving force here is to move away from them being hidden in production overheads to a situation where management are fully aware of how the decisions they make are going to lead to both internalised and externalised environmental costs. So how can management accountants help here? Well, we're going to look at a couple of techniques that might help. The first one is total quality management. Remember, we looked at TQM principles, things like getting it right first time and continuous improvement. Now, it's not a big step to think about how we can actually apply that to environmental management. Clearly, the objectives of the company here in an environmental sense would be to minimise things like complaints, oil spills or other spills, pollution, waste, and of course accidents. They should also think about when they design their products, they design them with the full life cycle in mind. So thinking about how the environment is going to be impacted maybe on disposal at the end of their life cycle, as well as just through their production as they're actually being processed through their life cycle. Now, the TQM cost of quality classifications can be applied quite easily to environmental costs. Internalised costs, remember these are the ones that are paid for by the company, we can kind of look at these as the internal failure costs. So putting things right while they're still under control of the organisation. So the external environment has yet to be impacted by them. The externalised costs, though, remember these are the ones that are paid for by society as well as the company, then these are probably likely to be much higher. And if you think about, for example, the recent BP oil spill, then think about the huge amount of damage that was caused by that, and it became, of course, a major strategic issue for that company. So these costs are going to be very, very significant, and they're going to have an adverse impact on the external environment. And they're going to be paid for by society, although they're caused by the organisation. In lecture example 2, you're asked to complete the following statements that describe and give examples of an environmental internal failure cost and an external failure cost, using words and phrases from the table. So, press pause, and when you're ready, press play. Okay, working through the statements then. An environmental internal failure cost is one incurred and paid for by the company. So that's the first solution, to ensure that it does not contravene regulation or legislation. So examples would be installing on-site water treatment processes or treating some unexpected toxic materials. An environmental external failure cost is one incurred because of some sort of environmental damage. The costs are significant. Many of them are intangible, such as bad publicity and fall in brand value. Another example would be a financial penalty or contaminating a local river. So that gives you an example of external and also internal, and quite good at actually looking at some of the wider implications. For example, intangible aspects, so the damage to a company's reputation that might occur because of environmental damage. So that's a really important point. The final section looks at another technique that might be quite useful, and that is activity-based costing. Now, in order to work out what environmental costs are and to fully integrate them into management accounting, then we need to use activity-based costing principles. What we'd do is we'd group environmental costs into what we call cost pools. And we'd have a look to see what was actually causing each cost, and we'd call it an environmental cost driver. Now, we're going to be looking at this a little bit later when we look at activity-based costing in more detail. Now, the implication of this is that if we do this correctly, then products that actually go through most polluting processes, so cause the most damage to the environment, would actually absorb more environmental costs than the more green products. And that means that we can actually do a number of things. First of all, we can actually price our products much better. So we can actually start to have customers pay for products that do damage to the environment. There's also an increased awareness of how environmental costs behave, and this is going to help us in our budgeting and our forecasting. And then we can do much better in terms of production decisions as well. So we can actually work out the full cost of a product, and we can therefore work out the profit from each product. So when we're trying to think about maybe ranking different products, if we've got, for example, limited resources, we can do it with the full knowledge of what each particular product costs us.